Hello everyone, this is Savannah Betkowski, Project Assistant at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar entitled Designing Water Rate Structures that Support Your Utilities Objectives. This session is one of several webinars conducted by the Environmental Finance Center Network for the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project. The EFCN provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all 50 states and 5 territories to help local water systems achieve and maintain compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And here you can see the various centers that make up the Environmental Finance Center Network. You can see that we have centers spread all across the country. And here you can see the areas of expertise that the EFCN focuses on. Workshops, trainings, and direct assistance are provided on asset management, rate setting and fiscal planning, water loss reduction, accessing infrastructure financing programs, water conservation, resiliency planning, a wide variety of areas. The EFCN also has a small systems blog. You can learn more about water finance and management through this blog. Blog posts feature lessons learned from our trainings and technical assistance, descriptions of available tools, and small systems success stories. You will have the opportunity to subscribe to this blog at the end of the webinar. In addition to workshops, direct technical assistance, and webinars, as part of the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project, we are also creating a table that lists the major funding sources for drinking water infrastructure projects in each state and territory. Here's how you can access those tables. From the EFCN homepage, go to the Resources tab, and then click on Funding Sources by State. This will take you to a map of the country. If you click on the state you're interested in, you will find a PDF table of the relevant funding sources for drinking water infrastructure in that state. The table looks like the image on the left-hand side of the slide. For each funding program, it includes the name of the program, a short description, and contact information for someone who works in the program. At this point, I would like to turn the presentation over to our presenter. Today we have Shadi Eskoff, Senior Project Director at the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Shadi, welcome and take it away.
Thank you very much, Savannah, and thank you everybody for logging in and for registering. I also want to thank everybody who submitted questions as part of the registration process. We got a fair number of questions coming in already, and we adjusted the slides to answer some of those questions, and we'll take some of those also on the air. But please feel free, as you're listening in, at any point, submit your questions in the questions box. I might not get to it right away. I think we'll save some time towards the end to be able to answer some of those questions. So please submit, and just know that even though we don't answer right away, we are logging all your questions. So we'll get to them as soon as possible. First question that always comes up is, will these slides be available? Yes, and we're also recording this webinar, and the recording will be made available to you all as well. So today we're going to be talking about designing water rate structures that support your utilities objectives. And to do that, we're going to cover 3 quick things. We're going to present the basics of different rate structure design components, not the rates part, but the actual design, what the rate structures look like and how are they designed to fit and to charge customers for different levels of consumption. Discuss how, when it's appropriate to favor some elements over others. And then finally, we'll introduce some tools and resources that can help you with rate setting in general. So to start, Savannah, we do have a poll question for the audience. Thank you. I'd like to know what your experience is. For those of you right now listening in this webinar, what's your experience and knowledge of various rate structure designs? So block rate structures, uniform rates. Are you very familiar with those concepts? Are you relatively new to this area, so you'd like some of the basics? This will help me kind of judge whether to talk about the basics a little bit more, or to talk about, to kind of skim through the basics, but to talk a little more of the in-depth piece a little bit more.
And we'll leave this poll open for another 5 seconds. Getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, thank you. So we have an even split across the board. Some of you are not very familiar with it and would like to know some of the basics, and then nearly half of you, maybe about a third or so, have worked on rates for several years, so you're probably already familiar with some of the concepts. since the majority, slight majority, but since the majority are either not familiar with the rate structure designs or it's relatively new, you're familiar, but it's still kind of new, I'll favor a little bit going over some of the basics a little bit more, and that will give everybody else an opportunity to kind of listen in and to learn about some of the rate structure designs that you might not have worked with in the past as well. But I will talk a little bit about the basics to some degree in order to make sure everybody's caught up. Thank you. So let's start with the terminology, rates versus rate structures. I want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing here. A typical rate structure and rates might look like this. A utility will be charging customers $32 a month, which includes the first 2,000 gallons of water, which means that the first 2,000 gallons will not be charged any more than $32. After that, they'll be charging $2 per 1,000 gallons for any use between 2,000 to 5,000 gallons, $5 per 1,000 gallons for any use between 5,000 and 20,000 gallons. So you start with the $2 per 1,000, then you go up to $5 per 1,000, then it goes up to $6 per 1,000 for any consumption above 20,000 gallons. So for the terminology, these numbers, the dollars and cents, the $32, the $2, the $5 per 1,000, those are the rates. We're not going to be talking about the rates very much in this webinar. We're not going to tell you how to price these rates. That's a different webinar. We are going to be talking about the rate structure, which is, do you include a consumption allowance with the base charge? Do you have a block rate structure or a uniform rate structure? What are the sizes of the blocks? When should you favor block rates over uniform or something of the sort? So when we talk about rate structure, we're talking about the design of the rates, not the actual dollars and cents. More terminology. That's $32 per month that's being charged. Some utilities call it a minimum charge. Some utilities call it a customer service charge or administrative charge, or there's lots of different names for labels for these types of charges. We're going to call them base charges. So when I'm talking about base charge, it's just that dollar per month or dollar per every 2 months, whatever it is that you're charging for zero consumption. So that's the base charge. Any consumption that's included in that base charge, we're calling it consumption allowance. The dollars per 1,000 gallons or dollars per 100 cubic foot, those are the volumetric rates. Those are the prices that you're setting that are dependent on the volume of water that customers are purchasing from you. So you've got the base charge and the volumetric rates. That's the very typical way that utilities of all types charge customers here, a base charge plus volumetric rates. And then if you have block rates, these are the blocks that you see here. So for this utility, it's between 2,000 to 5,000, and then between 5,000 and 20,000. These are different volumetric units that charges different rates. So you can charge different rates for different blocks. Okay. Before I move on, I want to make sure that I address the questions from the investor-owned utilities, because we did get a couple of those by email already or by registration. We're going to be focused more on the general rate structure designs, which applies to everybody, including the investor-owned utilities. But keep in mind, investor-owned utilities, that you do have an extra step of having to get your rates approved through the Utilities Commission. So there may be some rate structure designs that I'll talk about here that your Utilities Commission may or may not be favoring. So keep in mind that you're in a different kind of rate setting environment than a lot of the local governments who are listening in on this webinar. And some of you on the local governments, most of you are probably you're relying on your council or your boards, your local boards, to set or to approve the rates without any further oversight from the state, for example. In some states, though, like Wisconsin, there is a Utilities Commission or a PSC that oversees the rate setting as well. So again, if you are being regulated on the financial side, keep in mind that the regulatory agency might have some specific guidelines about what you can or cannot do. Okay, Savannah, we have a second poll question for the audience. Now that you know that we're talking about the rate structure designs as part of this webinar, I'd like to know, when was the last time that your utility has considered changing the rate structure design? Not the rates. You might have raised rates the past few years, but the rate structure design itself, switching from uniform rates to increasing block rates, or adjusting the balance between the base charges versus the volumetric rates, or even how often you charge your customers, whether it's monthly or bi-monthly. When's the last time that you looked at changing, even though you might not have changed, but just seriously thought about changing your rate structure design?
And we'll leave that poll open for another 5 seconds. Getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1.
All right, thank you. So it's also split almost evenly between the different categories. So some of you, about a fifth of you, have not or have looked at changing rate structures in the past 2 years. So you've gone through a lot of the things I'll be talking about here, which is looking at different elements of the rate structure and deciding whether or not they make sense for your customer base. But there are quite a few of you, 8 and 16%, so 24% that have not looked at changing rate structures in more than 3 years. And a fair number of you don't know, or it was before your time. And that's not uncommon. A lot of times utilities have stayed with the rate structure and kept that as is, and all they've tried to do is just look at the budget and change the prices, change the rates that were being charged to make sure that the revenue that they get will be enough, without thinking about changing the rate structure design itself. But I'll try to make the case here that even the rate structure should be considered, every few years. You should be considering at least looking at that and seeing whether or not that should be adjusted. And I'll explain why that is in just a minute. Thank you, Savannah. All right. I often get asked the question, I even got asked that question in the registrations, what rate structure do we recommend? Do we prefer a block rate structure or uniform or something of the sort? And our answer is always this. There is not going to be one rate structure that fits, that works perfectly for all utilities. In fact, two neighboring utilities with similar, almost similar customer bases in the same area might find a need to have completely different rate structures. One of them might be a purchased water system and the other one treats its own water. And for that reason, you have a lot of different variations in your cost structures, which means that your rate structure design should be different. So I'll be talking about general practices and general designs, and then it's up to the utility to decide based on their customer base and based on their objectives what exactly makes sense. And we'll try to help you think through those kind of questions as part of this webinar. But keep in mind that no one rate structure fits perfectly for everybody. I'll be talking a lot about rate structure designs, and we had written this a guidebook for North Carolina water systems back in 2009, I believe, but it applies to any utility. There are a few North Carolina specific points in there, but really a lot of the guidelines in there apply to any utility. So it's a free guidebook. It's available on our website, and again, these slides will be made available to you, so you can download the PDF and just go to link, or you just go to our website and then search for designing rate structures to support your objectives. If you have the PDF, you can click on the direct link. But a lot of these pictures and a lot of the images that you'll see here, a lot of the points I'm making are basically the same things that you'll see in this guidebook. Okay, so for some utilities, you've just completed budget season and rate setting season, so this might be familiar. For some of you, this is new. When you're reviewing rates every year, there are a lot of questions that probably come up as part of the discussion, either internally or with a consultant. Will the rates that we're planning on setting, will they be sufficient to cover all of our costs? And what does that exactly mean? What are all of our costs? Should we include things like watershed protection or so on? Is the rate structure following applicable laws? So in states like California, there's some very specific laws about what you can and can't do. In other states, it's pretty open. Are we allocating the cost to the right customers? Are we being fair? Making sure that we're charging the right customers the right amount. Will our customers understand these rates? Are they simple enough that people can understand it without getting frustrated? Will they be able to pay these rates? Affordability is always a question. Do the rates send the right signals to the right customers based on our objectives? So for example, if we're trying to encourage conservation, we're in a drought period, are we setting rates that are actually encouraging wasteful use as opposed to encouraging conservation? And then will the revenues be resilient to changing water demand? There's a lot of questions in here, and honestly, we can do a webinar on each one of these thought bubbles. But some of the points you'll see kind of come up in some of these slides coming on. The process of setting rates, in between the times when you're thinking about setting rates, you should be learning about the just essential basic information, background information about rates and about your customers as well. So it's by attending webinars like this one, or by going to workshops or talking to your peers, learn as much as you can about different rates, different rate structures. Sign up for blogs, whether it's ours or other organizations. There are a lot of blogs right now that talk about rate setting. Like, for example, I'm not sure if everybody knows, Philadelphia just passed a new, they have a new rate structure that's based on income, and that's, it's a different kind of rate structure that's a little bit unique to the country. So learning about some of this basics will help you as you set your rates going forward. Determining the critical characteristics of your utility community and the priorities, that is a very important step that should not be underestimated. Knowing who your customer base is, knowing the makeup of your customers, whether it's all residential or it's a 50% residential and 50% commercial and maybe a couple of industrial customers, or if you have a lot of outside, customers are sitting outside the city limits versus inside. There's a lot of differences between customers, and how you charge them should be based on what your customer base looks like, as well as what your utility objectives are. Knowing that information, that's when you can start designing the rate structure itself, and knowing, okay, we need a block rate structure, and we want to have a high base charge and low volumetric, or whatever design you want. But you set up the rate structure design based on the information that you've just gathered about your customers and about your utility objectives. Then you calculate what the rates need to be. So this is the part where, during the budget season, you're going through, you're trying to calculate what the rates need to be next year in order to generate enough revenues for you. Once you've set that, reevaluate and adjust the rate structure to make sure that that you are meeting all the objectives that you've set to do in that second step. If not, go back to the rate structure, tweak it a little bit, and then recalculate what the rates are. Once you're happy with that, that's when you go take it to either the Utilities Commission or you take it to the board for approval. But this is generally kind of a very, very big picture view of what rate setting looks like from year to year. So let's talk about understanding your utility and your served community. Here are some of the questions that you could be asking. There are a lot more questions that you can ask, but these are some that get you started. Have your customers' water use patterns been changing lately? We're finding out, for example, that a lot of utilities are seeing that their total demands are going down. Even though population is going up, water efficiency has been outpacing the growth in population, and that their total demands have declined. Or some utilities have seen that some of their larger customers, industrial customers, have shut down or have moved town, and that really affects water use patterns significantly and very abruptly as well. In other cases, growth for a community might show that your demands are going so quickly that you're going to be meeting your capacity needs or capacity sooner than you expected. So you might be trying to encourage conservation. Do you expect to meet your demands comfortably going forward? So think about what your demands are and what those projections look like. What's the makeup of your served community? I mentioned some of those. Here are some sub-questions. Do you serve a lot of large families in your community? What's your community's ability to pay? Are you a seasonal community, or are your customers basically there year-round? Again, the question of growth and decline. What's the proportions of residential and non-residential customers, and how many customers of, how much water is your biggest customer base using? How often will your customers, have they been able to afford their bills? So if your rates are just essentially very unaffordable for most of your customers, then there's ways to tweak your rate structure to make it a little more affordable, and also hopefully generate enough revenue to meet all of your costs. In the past few years, have you how much of your revenues and costs have been fixed versus variable? I have a slide later on about this point, and we've mentioned it in other webinars before, so I'll come back to that one a little bit later. Have your operating expenses changed, and if so, how have they changed recently? You might want to adjust your rate structures to generate the revenues that you need. Do you know whether what your capital expenses are and debt service payments are going forward, which then feeds into what your costs are going to be and then it helps you decide how to structure your rates and what the balance between the fixed versus variable rates or the base charges versus volumetric rates. Oops. So knowing that information, those are the kind of questions you should be asking yourselves now and trying to learn about your customer base. We also need to know what the utility's objectives are. And here are 4 of many different kinds of objectives that your utility might have. And by your utility, I mean your board, as well as potentially the utility staff that communicates a lot with the board. So, and maybe it might even be the town, some of the decision makers in the town as well, even if you're an independent water system. So looking at these 4 objectives: full cost recovery, revenue stability. Hoping that everybody on this call is, wants to meet that kind of objective. We want our rates to be able to cover all of our costs. Encouraging conservation. That's particularly in places where you might be meeting your capacity, or it's expensive for you to expand, so you're trying to reduce or to delay those expansions. Maintaining affordability. That's always a question that utility boards ask about, whether our customers can pay those bills, and then fostering business-friendly practices. Looking at all these 4 objectives, you might think, well, these are all great. I'd like to do all of them. And that's fantastic. But the problem is that some of these objectives might be competing with one another. So for example, if you say full cost recovery is my number 1 concern and my number 1 objective, and also maintaining affordability is my number 1 objective, that's going to be really hard to do, because in some cases, especially for small towns, small water systems, to have full cost recovery means that you do have to charge really high rates, especially if your demands are going down. And that makes the affordability question a lot harder. So there might be other ways to try to help the affordability piece if the full cost recovery is your prime objective. Or if you look at encouraging conservation and fostering business-friendly practices, to encourage conservation, some utilities like to charge increasing block rate structures, where the price goes up as you use more water. But if you do that and you charge that to all your customers, then the commercial and industrial customers will see that as a little bit punitive, where they need high volumes of water, and being charged an increase in block rate structure might make it much more difficult for them, much more costly for them to be able to operate in your town as opposed to other rate structures. So there are some trade-offs that you have to do between here. So what we normally do is we ask utilities to think about all of their objectives and to rank them, actually force ranking number 1, number 2, number 3. What are my main priorities? So I'm going to ask you to do that. There's a poll question next, Savannah. If you don't mind running that one, I want you to think about these objectives, these 4 objectives with another, and tell me which one's the single most important objective in influencing your rate structure. If you were the board, if you're the decision maker right now, what would you rank as your number 1? Is it to encourage economic development? Is it to recover costs? Is it to maintain affordability? Is it to promote water conservation efficiency? Or is it something else? And I'll tell you that, I'm not going to say that any one of these is the right answer or the wrong answer. All of these are the right answer. I just want to know from your perspective, what would you rank as number 1? Okay.
And we'll leave that poll open for another 5 seconds. Getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, thank you. So most of you said recover costs. 70% said that's your prime objective. And then it's kind of evenly split between the maintaining affordability or promoting water conservation. And then a few of you said other or encouraging economic development. Okay, so thank you. Savannah, let's roll the next poll question, please. So now that you've shown me what your primary objective is, I want you now to tell me what your second most important objective is. Is it, and don't pick the same one. Don't tell me that recover cost is your number 1 and your number 2. Pick something else. So if you've already answered number 1, think about, what is your second highest objective, and we can reveal that in a few seconds.
And we'll keep this poll open for another 5 seconds. Getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1.
Thank you. So looks like maintaining affordability comes in second place, and then more or less evenly tied between the other three. So it sounds like, if everybody in this room had answered, pretty much the same way, then the recover cost is number one, and maintaining affordability is number two for most of you, or for many of you, more so than any other combination that we're seeing here. But the conservation has always come in either third place in both of these questions. So that is also an important objective. So I'll keep that in mind as we talk about rate structures going forward. So thank you for letting me know where you stand. But this process, and Savannah, we can switch out of the poll now. So this process is one of the steps that we encourage utilities to do, to be able to think about these and to write them down, because when you are looking at different rate structure designs and the trade-offs between different rate structure designs, sometimes you'll be asking yourself, well, should I have a high base charge or a low base charge? Should I have a uniform rate structure or a decreasing block rate structure? And if you're asking yourself this question, going back to this list and knowing what your primary objective is and what your second objective is, will help you identify kind of what direction you want to be going if you're trying to meet your number one, number two objectives first. Okay, so here are different elements of rate structure designs, and we'll talk about, I think, almost all of them. Might skip one, but we're going to talk about different customer classes and distinctions, so charging different kinds of customers different rates, the billing periods, the base charge, the consumption allowance is included with the base charge, the volumetric rate structure, the number of blocks. If you have a block rate structure, then the number of blocks, the block sizes, and the rate differential. So basically, how do you structure your blocks? And then we're also going to be talking about potentially talk about automatic adjustments, depending on how much time we'll have to talk about that. Keep in mind also the frequency of rate reviews and rate changes. Even though that's not a rate structure design, it is something to consider. If you're looking at rates only every 3 or 4 years, that could be a problem. It might be more costly for you to try to do a rate increase at that point than if you had been looking at your rates consistently every year. We always advise to look at your rates at least every year, and rate structures every 3 to 4 years at least. And you might even do it more frequently, but at least reevaluate every 3 to 4 years whether you think the rate structure design still makes sense based on your objectives and based on your customer base characteristics. So let's look at customer classes and distinctions. These are different ways, and there may be other ways too, but these are the most common ways of charging different customer classes and different rate structures. One is you go the simple route where you have one rate structure that applies for all of your customers. It's simple, everybody's treated equally, you might call it fair, it's easy to administer, it's a lot less headache for your staff and for the billing software to be able to handle if you only have one rate structure. So that's the simple way. Some small towns prefer that because their customer base is relatively homogeneous. Pretty much everybody's, the water consumption patterns are very similar across the board for most of the customers, so there's no real reason to complicate the rate structure. The next step is to separate out rates for residential customers from commercial customers or industrial or not just general non-residential, having different kind of customer classes and charging different rates and different rate structures for each of these customer classes. And by doing so, each of those rate structures that you're designing is targeting a specific type of customer. So if I have a residential customer class and a non-residential customer class, then I can have, if the residential customer class is using so much water, I'm trying to encourage conservation, then I could be charging a conservation-oriented residential rate structure and then a rate structure that's more simple or that's more business-friendly for the commercial, the non-residential customers. So different rate structures with meeting different objectives for different customer classes. You could have a rate structure that's just one rate structure for everybody, but you have different base charges based on the meter size. That's really the same thing as what I just talked about, because customers with larger meters are usually non-residential customers. So you're kind of separating out the residential from the non-residential and maybe the multifamily housing as well. But the really large meters, the 6-inch meters or the 10-inch meters, those go to wholesale customers, so you can be charging them higher or different kind of capacity charges. one rate structure for everybody, but with the blocks that implicitly only target non-residential use. I'll explain that when I show you an example of that later on. There are some utilities that have a negotiated rate structure with an individual customer, typically an industrial customer. Now, when you do that, I always advise, to have your rate structure be defensible. I wouldn't say I have a rate structure for all customers and one rate structure for grocery store X or, for Acme Water or Acme something company. Because, that looks like you're charging them a very specific rate structure that's different than everybody else. So are you treating them equitably and fairly is going to be a question. Preferably, what you would be doing is charging a rate structure that's for a customer class that encompasses that kind of customer, but then any other customer that comes in that is similar to that customer. So you're charging Acme this kind of rate, but you're calling it the large industrial customer. Then any other large industrial customer that comes in that looks like Acme will get charged the same rates as well. So you're being fair and equitable that way. And then different customers for customers who are living outside city limits versus inside city limits. It's a very common practice to have outside rates for municipal utilities. There are some questions in some states whether or not that's permissible or how far you can take that. But that is a common different way of distinguishing between customer classes. The second design element we'll talk about is the billing periods, and either you can charge monthly, you can charge every 2 months, bi-monthly, or you can charge quarterly, or in some cases semi-annual or even annual. Choosing which way you go affects a lot of things. Affects, first of all, how often you have to go read the meters. So the more frequently you're billing, the more frequently you have to go out and read meters. So it's a higher expense for your utility. But at the same time, it's also giving the customer a bill more frequently. Those bills will be smaller amounts than if you had waited, for every third month or every second month to send them a bill. So they're a little bit more manageable. And customers typically do better with smaller bills that are more frequent than a large bill that comes less frequently, because it's easier for, on the cash flow side for them to be able to pay these smaller bills over time. And also it captures any kind of water losses. So if there's a leaky toilet, for example, and you only charge them every 3 months, then if the leak happens right after you just build them, they're not going to find out that there's a leak until 3 months later when you send them an astronomical bill, and then they come to you and say, well, I need a price break here because I had a leaky toilet, and you have to adjust for that, and that might be a lost revenue for you. So more frequent billing means that the customer as well as you can monitor water use more frequently and try to capture some of these water loss issues. High base charge versus low base charge. That's actually a critical question, and we're seeing a lot of utilities thinking about this in particular. For utilities that are trying to make sure that they have enough revenue to always cover their costs, to have revenue resilient rates, it's very tempting to have higher base charges because the base charges don't depend on how much water you're selling. So this is what the difference between fixed revenue and variable revenue. Base charges are fixed revenue. If the customer drops to zero consumption, they're still paying that, that base charge. That base charge does not change, as opposed to the volumetric rates, which does depend on the volume. So the higher the base charge, the more revenue you're getting, the more fixed revenue you're getting, and the more stable your revenue will be. And that's important for utilities where customer consumption patterns either fluctuate so much or declining, and you're trying to protect your revenues from years where water use is lower than you're projecting. So high base charge is important in that way. On the other side, high base charge is less affordable for customers, especially for customers who use very low volumes of water. They don't need very much, but you're still charging them $40 a month. So it's less affordable, and they have less control over their bill than if you charge them low rates. So if you're trying to encourage conservation, or you're trying to send them a bill structure where you're encouraging people to reduce consumption, having a low base charge helps, because if a customer reduces consumption, they'll see a bigger decrease in their bill proportionally than if you had a high base charge. So it's a question of, what are you trying to encourage here? Are you trying to encourage resident stability or conservation? And again, see, this is where the trade-offs start coming in. So here are some examples of what base charges look like. You can do a constant base charge where it's just $35 a month for everybody. Or you can do a base charge based on the meter size, so $35 for 5/8 inch or 3/4 inch meter, which is mostly residential customers, $55 for 1 inch meters, $105 for 2 inch meters, and so on. These two are very, very common ways of charging base charges. There are, of course, unique base charges being set by some utilities. Austin, Texas, for example, has a unique one, but we're not going to go into that. I'm just going to talk about the basics here. With the base charge, you could include a consumption allowance. So you might say, well, that $35 a month is going to include the first 2,000 gallons. Or you could choose not to. You can just charge $35 a month for 0 gallons, and then as soon as they start using consumption or start using water, you will charge them your volumetric rates. The benefits, the pros and cons, you can kind of see them on the slide here. If you include a high amount, really that's because you might be charging a high base charge and you're trying to give them some kind of a break on the affordability side. So you say, all right, well, the first 2,000 gallons, even though we're charging you, $40 or $35 a month, we're going to give you the first 2,000 gallons as a way to kind of offset what the charges are for the customers. But when you do that, again, that removes that control that the customer has on how much they can affect their bills by changing their water use patterns. If you don't include any consumption allowance, then the bills and the revenues that you're charging, or the bills that you're charging and the revenues you're collecting, are more they're more sensitive to use changes. So customers that see that their bills, you're charging them $10 a month and for 0 gallons, but they're using 3,000 gallons. They reduce it to 1,000 gallons. They'll reduce their bills quite a bit, and that affects your revenues as well. So your rates and revenues will be more sensitive to usage. So now we're going to be talking about the volumetric rate structures. Here are different kind of elements that you could use. Uniform rates or flat rates is, that's a common way of charging for water for a lot of customers. In this case, you're charging a single price, a single rate. So let's say $2 per 1,000 gallons, or $3. Let's say $3 per 1,000 gallons. You're charging that $3 per 1,000 gallons regardless of the consumption that the customer is using above the consumption allowance. So for all these rate structures, the volumetric rates, they start after the consumption allowance. All right. So for $3 above, $3 per 1,000 gallons for any consumption above the consumption allowance, for a customer, if you look at the right-hand side, their bill goes up straight line, linearly. They start with the base charge, and then their bill just keeps going up straight. It's simple. Everybody understands it. It's fair. The more you use, your bill goes up, but you're not charging any kind of different price for different volumes of water. You could do the same thing with seasonal rates. And really, seasonal rates can apply to any rate structure, not just uniform. But in this case, we're showing an example of uniform rates. It's the same thing. You're charging one price for all consumption, but for different times of the year or different seasons, you're charging different rates. So for high use, so if your customers are using more water in the summer than they are in the winter, you might charge them higher rates, charging $4 per 1,000 gallons in the summer, and then in the wintertime, you're charging them $2 per 1,000 gallons. To doing that, you're charging rates that are higher during the high season in order to try to incentivize conservation and to reduce the demand, because as you get closer to your capacity, as your peak demand gets closer to your capacity, that's when you start looking at really expensive capital or water system expansions. So you're trying to incentivize peak shaving or reducing those peak demands, and seasonal rates is one way of doing that. It's a very useful tool, especially for seasonal communities as well, where you have a lot more customers coming in during the high season, your water use just goes through the roof, and then in the low season they all leave, and you have a very low use customer base. Block rate structures are, well, they were very common. I mean, historically, decreasing block rates were the most common way of charging water. We've moved away from that, generally speaking, as a country. Uniform rates became the more common way, and now more and more utilities are looking at increasing block rate structures. Block rates are different than uniform rates, just because you're charging them different prices for different volumes. So in the decreasing block example, what you see here is utilities charging $4 per 1,000 gallons for any consumption up to 15,000 gallons. And then anything above 15,000 gallons is going to be charged at a lower price, at $2 per 1,000. So the bill goes up is a straight line, and then at some point at that, close to that break point, it slows down, the slope decreases a little bit. That's a decreasing block rate. An increasing block rate is the opposite, where you're charging a higher price for higher volumes. So for low use consumption, you're charging them a low price, $2 per 1,000. For high use volumes, you're going to be charging them a much higher rate, $4 per 1,000 for that high use. And the bill goes up much more quickly that way. All right, so the differences between the two of them, with the increasing block rates, that's a common way for utilities to charge when they're, again, trying to encourage conservation, or they're trying to just kind of send a message that that discretionary water use, especially during the summer, or like watering lawns, washing cars during the summer, something like that, when you have peak demands happening at your utility, is an expensive proposition for the utility. Therefore, it should be a higher price for the customer as well. So it's almost the same thing as a seasonal rate structure, but you're applying that year round, because you don't care if the customer is using high use in the high season or low season, but you're trying to charge higher prices for high use so that you're encouraging customers to reduce that discretionary use and just drop to what they need for the basics, the washing, cooking, eating, drinking. Decreasing block rate structures historically were being charged because engineers designed water systems, and they were the first ones to set the rates, and they said, well, we have margin, we have economies of scale, and if we build this big, massive water treatment plant, then for the extra 1,000 gallons that we produce, the total cost for us actually drops a little bit, so we can charge lower prices as consumption goes up, which is similar to, if you go to a grocery store and you buy the big bag of toilet paper, the price per one roll of toilet paper drops, as opposed to if you buy the smaller bag. Same idea, economies of scale are driving these prices. But the problem with that on the residential side is that you're showing them that the price for watering the lawn is actually cheaper than the price for drinking water and for showering inside the house. So it sends the wrong price signal when you're trying to encourage conservation. Now with non-residential customers, you might make a case for that. You might determine that your large customers are using so much water that they are driving your total costs, or your average costs are going down because of them, and you can make the case for a decreasing block rate structure for non-residential. You could have a block rate structure that targets different kinds of customers in the same time. So in this example, I'm showing a block rate structure where the price increases. It goes from $2 per 1,000 from 0 to 8, and then goes to $4 per 1,000 between 8 and 15, and then it drops. So it increases and then drops, or it might decrease and then increase. By doing that, you're kind of targeting the customers who are using the volume of water that's in that high block period. So in this case, in this one example, I can look at this and say, well, I think what you're doing is you're charging an average price for residential customers for average consumption. Above average consumption, above the 8,000 gallons, you're charging them a high price, but above 15,000 gallons, which is not where for a lot of places in the country, most customers don't use, most residential customers don't use 15,000. I think you're charging a lower price here because you're targeting the non-residential customers. So this one rate structure kind of tries to do three things at once. It's a complicated rate structure. It's complicated to explain it to the customers, and but it is one way of doing it where you wouldn't have to charge a rate structure for residential class and then residential for non-residential class, and charge separate rate structures. There's another example. It's called Uniform One Block Rate. I'm going to skip that one because it's very rare, but if you're interested to know how, I really want to be encouraging conservation, is there something even stronger than a strong uniform rate or a strong increase in block rate structure? And the answer is yes. This one would definitely be much stronger as far as sending a price signal. I'll be happy to talk to you about that if you send me an email. Some utilities have uniform rates, but there's a cap, which basically means I'm charging uniform rates and then $0 per thousand above a certain volume. Never do that for water. I would say that's you definitely don't want to be sending a $0 price signal for water consumption. But this is usually done for wastewater, for residential customers only, because for some utilities they think that anything above that high volume, anything above 18,000 gallons in a month, might basically be anything that's being used outdoors, not indoors. So the water is being applied on lawns or driveways, and they're not coming back to our wastewater treatment plant, so we shouldn't be charging customers for wastewater rates. So this can apply, this is good for wastewater, but not for water. Budget-based rates, I know some of you are here from California and from other places out west. That's where you have you can have different block rate structures where each block rate structure is customized for each individual customer. So you have a household and you say, well, that household has specific needs, their characteristics, they might have 3 bedrooms, for example, and so their water use needs are different than a household that has 10 bedrooms. So their blocks are going to be different, and we charge each individual customer a customized rate. Again, if you're interested to know a little bit more about that, please talk to me. This is a little more complicated than the kind of basics that I'm covering here today. The last example I want to talk about is a non-volumetric rate structure. So some utilities, even registering, asked me about this, where you charge a fixed charge that's not related to any volume. And that's because you might not have meters, for example, or it's a small customer base. You just need the fixed amount. That is another viable way of doing it. Of course, you're completely removing any incentive for the customer to reduce wasteful use or to be efficient in their use because they're all paying the same amount. And also, it might be considered not fair if you have 2 customers or neighbors. One of them uses only 1,000 or 2,000 gallons a month. The other one uses 50,000 gallons a month because they're just, washing their house outside every single day. They're just being wasteful. You're charging them the exact same amount, and that becomes the question of fairness and equity comes into play. But if you don't have a way to measure the water, it's hard to really charge anything other than non-volumetric rates. If you do have block rate structures, so we're moving on to the next item now. Here are some questions to ask yourselves as you're designing your rates. First, you need to decide on how many blocks to charge. Do you have 3 blocks, or do you charge for 10 different blocks? How many times do you change the price? We usually advise to kind of try to keep it as simple as possible, but 2 is sometimes maybe too little. I would say maybe 3 to 5 is pretty much, maybe even personally I would go for 3 or 4. 5 might be a little bit too much, but looking at your water use patterns, if you just do a histogram of all of your consumption, all your bills, you might see some breakpoints. You might see there's a clump of bills that are for less than 3,000 gallons, and then there's another clump of bills that are between 3,000 and 6,000. Well, then maybe you should have a block that ends at 3,000 gallons and set a different price for the ones that go above 3,000. So look at the usage patterns for your customer base and see if there are some natural breakpoints there. If not, then I think 3 or 4 blocks makes sense for residential customers. For non-residential, it depends. If you have a very homogeneous non-residential customer base, then maybe you just need 2 blocks if you're going to do a block rate structure at all. But if you have a very diverse kind of customer base where you have some industrial customers and some low, small commercial customers, then you might want to have more blocks. And that really should be driven by what the consumption patterns are for your non-residential customer class. You'll see more natural breakpoints there than you would with the residential. Decide on where the blocks should end and start, and I kind of talked about that a little bit by just looking at the consumption patterns. But generally speaking, for residential side, we see that the first block either ends at about the average consumption of customers or even lower than the average, so where the minimum or the basic level of consumption might be, which is about 2,000 gallons or 3,000 gallons a month. So you might have a block that ends there, and then a block that ends around the average, and a block that ends slightly above the average. But then that final block is for anything that you might consider being discretionary water use. For the block rate to be effective, you want to make sure that the block prices are different. Don't charge. We've seen some utilities where they have have 4 or 5 different blocks, and the price between one block and the other goes up by 10 cents per 1,000 gallons. If you're going to do that, then what's the point of having the block rate structure? It's not really sending the customer any different kind of price signal. If you are going to have block rate structures, the prices need to be significantly different, that the customers actually recognize and can see the benefits of trying to keep the consumption on the low side if it's an increasing block rate. And then keep in mind your base charge and consumption allowance. The higher the base charge or the higher consumption allowance, the less control the customer has on their bill. And whatever you do with the block rate structure might not affect you might not be able to affect their consumption patterns as much as you would with a low base charge and no consumption allowance. Meter reading must be punctual, because if you're not reading meters every 30 days exactly, or 60 days in some cases, then you might be overcharging or undercharging customers because they're entering or exiting blocks because of the extra few days that you're reading bills. And then replace the meters frequently so that you're making sure that your meter reading is accurate and you're charging them at the right block, as opposed to, again, overcharging or undercharging because your meters were not capturing the right volumes. Consider the effects on large families. If you have a customer base that has a lot of large families, sometimes large families use a lot of water indoors for basic needs. So they may be using 10,000 gallons a month. And if you have an increasing block rate structure where the 10,000 gallons a month is in the third block, then that large family is paying high prices year-round, even though it's for basic needs, and you're trying to charge that increasing block rate structure thinking that that consumption is discretionary. So be careful when you're setting the high block rate. Make sure that, if you have a large family, then try to address how you can affect them. We talked about the frequency of rate changes. Review rates every year. Review rate structures every 3 or 4 years. And fixed versus variable revenues. I think we talked about that a little bit, where the variable revenues are the volumetric rates, and the fixed revenues are the base charges. What we've seen, because we're getting a lot of questions about this, we've seen a lot of utilities basically have about 20% of the revenues, generally speaking. Differs from utility to utility. Some utilities, or most utilities, seem to be charging 20%, or getting 20% of the revenues from the base charges and about 80% from the volumetric, give or take. By doing so, that means that as customers change their consumption patterns, 80% of the revenues are most of that 80% of the revenues are very sensitive to the customer demand changes. So some utilities have been trying to adjust it to where the fixed portion goes up and the volumetric portion goes down. But by doing that, that means pushing more rates on the base charge. It makes the affordability issue a little bit more tricky to handle, because you're charging higher rates or higher bills for low consumption as well. Keep in mind that maintaining low rates at the expense of your utility's financial health is not going to be helping affordability. That's a temptation a lot of utilities have. I want to charge full cost pricing, but it's too expensive, so I'm not going to charge full cost. I'm just going to charge low rates to help customers. That might help them in the short term, but in the long term, you won't have the revenues that you need to be able to invest in your infrastructure. Your infrastructure will deteriorate, water quality will decline, and now you're serving poor quality water to your customers, which affects public health. And then it becomes a more expensive issue trying to deal with that. So keep that in mind as well. We always advise, when you're looking at lowering your rates in order to maintain affordability, think about other ways to do that. So we have time to maybe go over one scenario of rate structures. I want to ask everybody to remember that one rate structure does not fit all rate structures. But I have a poll question. Savannah, if you don't mind pulling that up. I'd like to know which of these scenarios you'd like me to go over, and I'm happy to talk to you offline later on about other kinds of scenarios. I know everybody here has a very diverse circumstance, so I'm happy to talk, and Daniel, who's also listening in right now, will be happy to advise you one-on-one on what rate structure makes sense for your utility. But in this case, which scenario would you like me to present on? A groundwater system with a very small customer base, a small purchase water system. If you're worried about affordability, or water demand is too high or is decreasing, or your customer base is seasonal.
And will we...
You can select all that apply, but we'll just go with whichever one is the most common.
And we'll get ready to close that poll in 3, 2, 1.
Thank you. Okay, so there's interest in all of them, but the most common one that we see is groundwater system with a small customer base. So I'll talk about that one. The other ones have a little bit more different kind of rate structures, and all these slides are available, so you can kind of compare them and kind of see how rate structure designs differ from scenario to scenario. Thank you, Savannah. So the groundwater system with small customer base, generally speaking, would have relatively high costs per customer because the customer base is small, and most of your costs for utility are fixed costs. They don't depend on how much water you sell because you have debt service, you have salaries, you have a lot of things that are short-term fixed, and you need to pay them whether or not your customers are using more water or less water. So you have high fixed costs and a small number of customers to spread those costs on. So generally, as a starting point, I would say, well, from this case, I would go with thinking about doing a high base charge, possibly including a consumption allowance to kind of offset that high base charge. Definitely do monthly billing if you have a very small number of customers where reading meters is not a very expensive proposition. But if there are some cases where the cost savings of doing bi-monthly and reducing and only reading meters every 2 months as opposed to every month, there may be benefits where that cost savings outweigh the cash flow stability. But if you need the cash flow, which is also critical for small systems, then monthly billing is better because you will be getting your revenues in monthly as opposed to every 2 months cycling between different customers. But generally, the main point here will be the high base charges and consumption allowance. Now, if affordability is an issue, there are other ways to help affordability. In one case, you can try to do an increasing block rate structure where the first block is a low rate and higher and steeper rates for higher consumption. The other ways would be to look at options for customer assistance programs, and we've done webinars about that. So if you look on EFCN websites, you can see a lot of our past webinars. We've talked about customer assistance programs in the past. And again, we'd be happy to talk to you about these offline as well. So we're right at the top of the hour. I'm seeing I'm seeing a few questions have come in. Let me go over some of the resources because I think some of the questions have been asking, where do we start and what information can we use? And I've got some slides here that show you some resources. The process of setting rates we've already covered. So the resources are available to you. There are some manuals and some guidebooks that are available from AWWA on how to set the prices, how to calculate what your rates need to be. So those are available. EPA has a free version that you can also just download off of this link, or if that link changes, because EPA's website changes once in a while, I will just Google it. Start typing EPA and setting small drinking water system rates. You'll find this document that kind of walks you through calculating what the rates are. So you've already decided what the rate structure design will be. Now you're looking at how to charge prices. We got questions about conservation rate setting. There's a guidebook that we wrote. It was written for the state of Texas, but again, a lot of the points in here are very common and very applicable to other states as well. So the link, you can download that report when you get the slides. The Alliance for Water Efficiency, obviously their focus is water efficiency, and they've written a lot on rate setting, and they've produced tools available as well to help you with setting rates to encourage conservation. And as far as I know, they're the most, they've done some studies as well that look at the long-term cost savings of conservation-oriented rate structures. So for utilities that have tried to do conservation-oriented rates, what were the cost savings for them by reducing the short-term demands, even though that affects short-term revenues, by postponing some of their expensive capital projects. So I recommend looking at their website as well. If you're interested in customer assistance programs and affordability, which some of you mentioned that you were, we've just completed a study that looks at every single state and what are the legal pathways for utilities to create rate-funded customer assistance programs. So can you, as a utility, do something to create a fund where customers who can't afford their bills can come in and ask for assistance, and there's this fund that can help them pay their bills so that they can stay connected to your water system. And we have an if you go to the website, we have an interactive map where you click on your state and it produces a PDF that shows you the legal, what you can and what you can't do for your state as of a few months ago. There are various decision-making tools that we use at the EFC, so we do a lot of direct assistance. And Daniel, who's sitting here next to me, does a lot of one-on-one work with small water systems for free, thanks to EPA's cooperative agreement. And some of these tools include a rates analysis model, for example, where you can put in what your expenses are going to be and then set your rate. So you know what your rate structure design is. You can use this tool to test, to stress test different kinds of rates that you might charge and see how those will generate revenues, whether those revenues will be enough to meet all of your expenses. So that's a tool that Daniel has used to help utilities assess rates. There's a tool to look at the financial health of the utility, and then we have dashboards for I forgot how many states now, I think 14 or 15 states, that help utilities compare what their rates are to other utilities as well, and whether or not the rate structure has a price signal that is encouraging conservation, and whether the rates are meeting affordability metrics. So at this point, I think I'm going to turn over to Savannah to ask the last couple of poll questions, and I'll read the questions that have come in. It might be if anybody wants to stay for another 2 minutes, I'll answer a couple of questions that have come in while Savannah puts up the next poll questions.
Of course. So our final 2 quick polling questions are if you would like to subscribe to the Environmental Finance Center blog. Again, if you don't have the chance to sign up or submit your polling question today, you can sign up for the blog on our efcnetwork.org website. And getting ready to close that poll in 3, 2, 1. And finally, if you are a small water system of 10,000 or fewer people served, are you interested in receiving in-depth technical assistance? If you're unsure about technical assistance or do not have the opportunity to submit your polling answer today, you can review the technical assistance form on the efcnetwork.org website. And lastly, and I'm sorry, getting ready to close that poll in 3, 2, 1. And lastly, there will be a survey link coming through the chat box. You will receive this in a follow-up email, but if you could just give us a few minutes to let us know how today's session went, that would be great. And Shadi, I'll throw it back to you if you can answer any of those questions, and if not, you can follow up with them offline.
I will do that, thank you. So we got a couple of questions I can answer relatively quickly. One is there a suggested percentage of revenue that should come from the base charge as opposed to the variable rate? So how much of the revenue should be fixed versus how much should be variable? That's a tough one to answer because if you look at the costs on the other side, for most utilities that are not purchase systems, for most of the systems that treat their own water, you'll find that your costs are vastly fixed costs. 80 to 90% of your costs are fixed, and only 10 to 20% of your costs are truly short-term variable, because those are, the power and the chemicals, those are really the only short-term costs. Purchasing water is the other major variable cost as well. So if most of your costs are fixed and tiny amount is variable, the temptation is to say, well, okay, I need to match that with the revenues. I want to have 90% fixed revenues and 10% variable revenues. That way, if consumption goes down, then both my revenues as well as my expenses go down proportionally the same, I'm not going to be hurt so much. And that's that's one way of thinking about it. It's the right way of thinking about it. The problem with doing that, though, if you try to set your rates to achieve a 90% fixed revenue, that's going to make your base charge astronomical, and it's going to make affordability a really a difficult, it's a challenge not just for your low-income customers, but for the majority of your customers. So it becomes a difficult thing to do. If you look at AWWA's M1 manual, which talks about cost of service and how do you set these prices, how do you calculate those rates, they have a specific methodology in there that looks at allocating costs and looking at peak costs and trying to allocate those peak costs to different customer classes. And if you follow that methodology, eventually you end up with a rate structure where, generally speaking, again, you're back to that 25% fixed revenue and something 75% variable. On the other side, you might be trying to encourage conservation. If you're trying to encourage conservation, then you might be wanting lower fixed revenue and higher volumetric so that customers have the price incentive to reduce consumption. So the answer to that question is, I hate saying that it depends, but it depends on what your utility's objectives are. Again, so go back to that question early on where you were asked to rank your objectives. And also just kind of look and see how your revenues have compared to your expenses in the past few years, whether you've been trying to incentivize or you've had, a 20-80% ratio. Has that been enough to make sure that you always get enough revenue to meet your expenses? And if so, is there really a reason to change? Or if that ratio has been failing you the past few years, then there is an incentive for you or a reason for you to change. But as far as recommending a certain ratio between fixed and variable revenue, I don't do that. It's really hard to do that without looking at the numbers. So, whoever asked that question, if you're interested, feel free to send me or Daniel an email, and we'll be happy to kind of go through the numbers with you and see if changing that ratio makes some sense. We got a few more questions, and I think I've kept you guys on for 10 minutes over, so I apologize for that. I will go through these questions, and with the help of Daniel, thank you, Daniel, I'm signing him up, he doesn't know that, we will reply to all of the questions by email to make sure that, we'll ask whether or not we've answered your question already through the webinar, and if not, we can help address those questions. But everything I see here, most of them I see are very specific, either to the state or specific to the utility. So more information will be helpful, and if I try to answer them now, it might not be very illuminative for everybody else. So thank you, everybody, for your attendance and for your patience and for staying a little bit longer. I apologize for going a little bit over on time.
Thank you, Shadi. Have a wonderful day, everyone.